Hey, so this is part two of types of nonverbal communication. So one of the first elements, and one that's largely out of our control, that we need to talk about in terms of these types of nonverbal communication, is physical attractiveness. So we find that good-looking people enjoy a whole host of increased social benefits. Uh, Good-looking students get higher grades. Good-looking criminals get more lenient sentences when they go to court. In general, people who are physically attractive are rated as more kind, more sociable, and more interesting than their less attractive counterparts. We know that children as young as 3 pick their friends based on physical attractiveness. Physically attractive professors get higher evaluations. And all of this contributes to what's known as lookism, and this is something like racism, for example, that runs through the workplace. So women, in particular, suffer at the hands of lookism, and also sometimes benefit. Right. So physically attractive women get roughly an 8% bonus in pay for being attractive. They're paid about 8% on average more than let's say, average coworkers. And we know that there's a penalty for below average looks, and it can be as high as 13% for women. So I mean, obviously, this isn't fair, and it's not something that we can actually control. But it's further proof that regardless of whether or not we acknowledge it, that we do judge people oftentimes by how they look, and that affects how we interact with them. Now, the good news, if for less attractive folks, is that as we get to know people, generally we think they're better looking. This is particularly true if they have a pleasant or outgoing personality. So if God didn't give you, super looks, then have a great personality and get to know people, and chances are they'll generally think you're better looking over time. Now, one element that we can control with regard to appearance, of course, is clothing. And clothing, according to studies, says a lot about us. So we know, based on extensive social scientific study, that clothing conveys messages about things like economic history, current economic level, so how much money you have, your educational background, your current educational level, your general level of sophistication, your level of success, your moral character, social background, social position, and trustworthiness. So all of this is conveyed and interpreted from clothing, right? Just from the clothing we wear. So, unsurprisingly, studies show that we make assumptions about people based on how they dress. So, some of the more interesting experiments that we've done, and one of them, experimenters dressed in uniforms resembling police officers, so people who were dressed like cops, they weren't wearing police uniforms, but they were dressed like cops, were more successful than people just dressed as ordinary civilians in asking people to pick up trash. We know that people raising money for law enforcement are more effective if they're in uniform. Now, one example of this, they're not policemen, but they're firemen, right? I have a firehouse right around the corner from my house, and I see the guys out a couple times a year, usually in their uniforms with the suspenders on and stuff, right? And at least the pants, collecting money for the fire department. And they, of course, collect it in a boot. Now, the reason they do this is people give them more money when they're in uniform. We even find that if someone's nicely dressed and crosses the street against the light, right, crosses the street illegally, we're more likely to follow them if they're dressed nicely. Now, obviously, we don't sit and say, oh boy, that person's dressed really well and they're crossing against the light, so I'm going to do it too. These are oftentimes these messages that we take from people that affect our opinion of them and the way that we behave around them. These messages are absorbed subconsciously, right? They're absorbed in a way we don't even realize that these messages are affecting our behavior, but they are. So this is a slide that I show students when we're actually in class, and I ask them to tell me about each one of the pictures, and tell me about the people in them. And I think you could tell here that this provides a really interesting series of examples about what clothes say about us. Right? Usually when I ask about this fellow over here, they tell me that he's a well-educated professional with money. When I ask about this fellow here, I'm told that he's a blue-collar fellow who probably didn't finish high school and lives in a trailer park. And when I show this picture over here and ask them about the young ladies, now some people know that this is Snooky from Jersey Shore, right? But they tell me that they're generally probably uneducated and might have loose morals, right? So obviously clothes say something about us, and that's something that we consider, I think, again, sort of below the surface or subconsciously, even when we get dressed in the morning, right? We think about how we want people to think of us, and that affects what we wear, right? Because we know, even though we don't think about it sometimes, we intuitively know that how we dress says something about who we are. Now, another factor that we don't often consider consciously when we think about nonverbal communication is physical space. And the study of how people and animals use space is known as proxemics or proxemics. So one famous scientist by the name of Edward T. Hall studied personal space and proxemics and found some interesting things when it came to the way that we position ourselves in space and our relationships with others. So he found, for example, the people that had intimate relationships generally stood or sat within 18 inches of one another. Now, when people were dealing with reasonably close relations, friends, more distant relatives, generally they dealt with each other at a distance of about 18 inches up to 4 feet. Now, social distance, when you're out in a crowd of people or conducting business, generally you do it at about 4 to 12 feet from people. And public distance, right? So if someone is speaking, for example, like a professor in front of a class, generally you're dealing with distances of 12 feet and more. Now, I know you're not in the classroom, but if you were, one thing that you might notice the next time you're in a classroom is that there's usually between, I'd say, 12 and 14 feet worth of distance between where the professor stands and where the first row of seats are in the classroom. Now, again, the people who arrange those seats aren't sitting there thinking, oh, well, generally we're supposed to put these 12 feet out from the speaker. It's something that we just sort of know intuitively. It's something that we've learned over time in dealing with other people and watching others deal in these different kinds of scenarios. And these are the distances, for whatever reason, that we feel comfortable with based on our relationship with others. Now, when we're talking about space and we're talking about owning space and that feeling that a space is yours, that's what's known as territoriality. So your book defines it as feelings of ownership that pertain to particular areas. Now, of course, we talk about animals and their territory all the time, right? But we don't think about it with people as much, and people are territorial as well. One of the things that I think is funny is that in class, I never assign seats, but students will often come in and sit in the same seat from the first day of the class to the last day of the class. Now, there's no reason for them to sit there. I'm not asking them to sit there, but that's their seat. And if they come in and someone else is in their seat, they're not happy about it, right? So that becomes your territory, right? So humans are territorial as well. Now, interestingly, we grant people with higher status usually more territory, and in addition, we grant them a greater level of privacy. So, for example, if you're going to see a professor or a boss, chances are you'll knock on the door before entering. And the idea behind that, of course, is that you grant that person with higher status more privacy. We give CEOs bigger offices, right? More personal territory. So physical space is related to status, and that's related to communication. Another thing we don't think about a lot is physical environment. So the environment in which we communicate affects that communication. So we know, for example, that studies show that subjects who work in beautiful rooms are both more positive and energetic than coworkers who work in a drab kind of office space. We found that just taking a doctor's desk out of his office made patients 5 times more comfortable talking to him or her, right? We also find that grouping patients around a table so that they face one another doubled conversation. This is why, for example, in graduate school, if you go to graduate school, many of your courses will be held in a circle, right? And that's designed specifically so that in a seminar kind of course setting where everyone's expected to talk instead of a lecture style where one person is up there lecturing to the whole class, they found that sitting people in a circle so that they face one another increases conversation. Again, this is another slide that I showed to ask students then in class, hey, tell me about the people who live in these spaces. And it's surprising the kind of stories that people generate, right? Often I'm told, well, an old rich grandma lives here, right? Highly educated, lots of money, high social status, and so on. And the people who live over here are poor but proud, right? Is generally how the students seems to appraise these slides. Interestingly, this is Ralph Lauren's living room, polo guy. So they're right about his social standing and economic status. And this is actually a trailer, right? This is a trailer home that's lived in by a sort of, they're certainly not rich, but I hesitate to call them lower class, maybe lower middle class family that I know. So interesting observations about these spaces. Another thing that affects our communication non-verbally and can send messages is time, right? And we touched on this a little bit earlier when we talked about polychronic cultures and monochronic cultures. So chronemics is the study of how humans use and organize their time. And of course, the way we handle time can express both intentional and unintentional messages. So for example, if you purposefully don't respond to a text or an email for a while, you're sending a message, right? Again, it's impossible not to communicate. So not responding to someone's text quickly is a form of communication, right? Waiting, again, like I discussed earlier, can be a sign of status. So you'll wait for your doctor, but you won't wait for your burger at McDonald's. The amount of time that we spend with a significant other sends messages about valuing that person, right? And indeed, spending time together is a strong predictor of relational satisfaction. Couples that spend more time together are generally happier with one another. Also, quick responses, so if someone sends you a text or leaves you a message or calls you and expects a call back, a quick response usually will get a positive appraisal, right? So in other words, responding quickly makes people happy. All right, so that does it for this section. I hope you learned something, and thanks for checking out my video.